Coronavirus cases are climbing like crazy in the United States of America. Florida has more new cases than the entirety of Europe. The entirety of Europe. Florida alone, the state of Florida alone has more new cases. Some states are now taking initiative, but it is going to be political football, as is the case with every other issue, like wearing a fucking mask. Republicans are going to say it's the Democrats' fault. It's the protests that are happening. Democrats are going to say, no, the protests are not the reason. It's actually reopening the economy. It's actually a consequence of, reopening and people not wearing masks. As far as I've seen, there is empirical evidence to suggest that protests, of course, have increased coronavirus cases, but the spikes have come before the protests. The spikes now, 2 to 3 weeks after the protest started, is a consequence of exponential growth, which is how it happens, how coronavirus spreads. First, you have 4 people, then you have 4 people spread it to 16 people. You have 16 people spread it to 64 people. That's how it works. But overall, the protests, ironically, led to a decrease in movement for a lot of people. And the reason for why they led to a decrease is speculated that people were just afraid of going outdoors because of the protests happening. So while protests were a lot of people in a specific area, it's still nothing in comparison to 500,000 individuals walking around and doing their daily activities, especially in enclosed spaces, especially without social distancing, especially without wearing masks, whereas protests are largely mass individuals. All of them are outdoors, and that is at least the scientific explanation for it. I know that you will never, ever believe me if you think like, because it doesn't seem real. You're like, what the fuck? You mean you're gonna tell me that people were standing shoulder to shoulder and that actually didn't increase coronavirus? Well, I'm not saying it didn't. It certainly did, but the spike is absolutely a consequence of the restrictions being lifted rather than the protests. So I'm not even doing a rebuttal to Dan Crenshaw. I just wanted to explain my side. So, let's see.
Joining us right now with an update, Texas GOP Congressman Dan Crenshaw. Congressman, you concerned about Texas?
Well, we're definitely concerned. We're always going to tell people to keep taking precautions, wear your mask when you're in confined spaces with other people.
Dude, he was literally at a Joe Rogan comedy show and took photos with Joe where he wasn't wearing a mask. Maybe he was wearing a mask while the show was going on. I mean, I hope for his sake he was, for the sake of others he was, but I mean, I doubt it. I feel like Texans are number one at acting like this is a political message when you don't wear a mask, like as though you're doing something incredibly brave.
If you asked average Americans right now, based on media coverage, who do you think's doing better? Germany or Texas? Overwhelmingly, everybody would say Germany. They're highlighted as this great success story in the COVID narrative. The reality is Texas still has a lower death rate than Germany.
Wait, I'm confused. He says that Texas has a lower death rate than Germany. Okay, great, but that's kind of like saying. I mean, I don't really get it. It's like saying, like comparing New York City to the state of Texas or something, which is kind of what he did after. These are different countries, different states. Of course, they're going to have a different growth rate or a different spread rate. It's population density that plays a significant role here. The problem is a lot of these people don't want to compare their cases and their death rate to where they were individually. I'm all in for comparing, Texas to Germany. Sure, do it. Go off. You also have to look at your situation in Texas last month and compare that to the situation in Texas now. And to be fair, I don't really know what is going on because a lot of these southern states, according to cell phone data, again, a lot of these southern states didn't immediately see the peak of coronavirus spreading, or at least death rates peaking. Now, there was some statistics that were being falsely reported. We heard of news from health officials in Florida specifically getting in trouble for reporting numbers in a way that did not favor the messaging from Ron DeSantis, for example. But one thing that cell phone data showed was
sorry, I'm out of control.
that the state of Texas or other red states where population density is not super high, especially areas outside of, you know, Austin and Houston or areas outside of big cities, people were social distancing on their own. And by social distancing, I mean people were staying at home because they were fearful, regardless of what the legislature or regardless of what the governors were saying. I don't know if that changed. That's what I would look into. Did the activity rate change from the peak of coronavirus nationally to now, once states started making an effort to reopen the economy, and that was seen as like a green flag to just go do whatever you want to do, or it became a political culture war, a culture clash to open up the economy and not wear masks, for example. Compare Texas to Germany. Texas has 153,000 coronavirus cases, 2,416 deaths, 80,000 people have recovered. A lot of that's coming from big counties like Harris, Dallas, obviously where there are areas of high population density. Germany has 195,000 coronavirus cases and 9,000 deaths. The recovery rate is at 178,000. Now, notice how this is only at 80,000, and that's because a lot of the coronavirus cases that they're calculating is new. It's happening now. That is part of the problem. Comparing a state to an entire country is silly, even if that state is Texas. Germany's population is, what, twice the amount of the population in Texas? The state of Texas has 29 million people in 2019. Germany population is 83 million. In 2019, especially considering population density and landmass for a country like Germany, it's a little ridiculous. Mortality rate is a per capita argument. I know, but even when you use a per capita argument, looking at a country that is or twice as populated with half the size, population density plays a big role. Ultimately, what should be considered here is not how Texas is doing against Germany. It's how Texas is doing against Texas. This is the problem. This is what America hasn't been doing well as well. You don't compare America's curve to other countries. I mean, you do, to show whether they've been able to mitigate the first wave of coronavirus. But America hasn't been able to do that. Individual states have made a significant effort. What you have to compare America is to America, and not even state to state. How are we doing with respect to coronavirus spread prevention in comparison to where we were 2 months ago? So even when you look at this, the important thing to notice when you look at a graph like this is not like, look at how much larger the U.S. Graph is. Of course it is. U.S. is populated. There's a lot of people getting tested. Even though it wasn't enough for the longest time, and it wasn't early and it wasn't often. What you have to look at is what the graph is doing, what this line is doing. And it's so clear that while we were on the tail end of spread, prevention, we just said, F it. Like, it's so obvious. Oh, it is per million. Oh, this is a per capita. Oh shit, never mind. Okay, well, yeah, that's not great either. This is actually adjusted to per million. I didn't even realize. I thought this was just like totality. Yeah. So yeah, you can actually compare the size of it. The way coronavirus works is it takes 7 to 14 days to incubate. And that's when you're pre-symptomatic. And when you're pre-symptomatic, that's when you don't have any symptoms, but you're probably still spreading it by talking, especially being in an enclosed space. If people aren't wearing masks and people are touching one another, especially in bars. Bars are massive spreaders. They're super spreaders. There's a case study out of Michigan with one bar in a college town leading back to 80 individual coronavirus cases over the span of one night. It's literally, I mean, contact tracing shows gyms aren't even safe either. As someone who goes to the gym, I can tell you that is a significant problem. What is happening here is a significant problem because our spread prevention methods were working, as you can see here, and then we just decided to reopen the economy, and boom, it's a second spike. So we didn't even end the first wave. A lot of these countries are now seeing secondary waves. If you look at individual countries, not just like Canada or Europe or Japan, but if you look at Canada, if you look at South Korea, they are seeing small clusters where reopening has caused a spike in new coronavirus cases, and they immediately shut everything down when that happens. The only other country that's similar to the United States is Sweden and Brazil and Russia. Sweden, Brazil, and Russia are the three main countries that have
I can now remove
a significant problem. Maybe not Sweden as much as all the two other countries that I mentioned, but Russia and Brazil have gigantic problems with coronavirus. Brazil has an even worse problem than the United States of America because at least Trump, for all of his faults, is not as bad as Bolsonaro. The problem is, here's how coronavirus spreads. I'm gonna go through this again. So when you're pre-symptomatic, you don't show any symptoms, but you're spreading. And that is, even if you don't have symptoms, you're still spreading it most likely to other people. That's why the R naught for coronavirus is much higher than like the regular flu. So it's 7 to 14 days of an incubation period where you might be spreading. Once you realize you have it, what you're supposed to do is, stay the home and quarantine yourself. You figure that out, 7 to 14 days. Now you're almost at let's say 20 days. In that circumstance, you quarantine for 14 days, you get better. You survive. You may have long-term lung damage. Other people have reported that you don't get your taste and sense of smell back for at least another month throughout that process. But after all of that is said and done, there's a group of individuals who can't deal with it, especially if they are immunocompromised. So they have to go to a hospital. Once they're in the hospital, they are taking up ICU beds. If it gets even more, if it gets even crazier for them, if their body can't deal with it, they might have to be intubated. They might have to get a tube shoved down their throat and pump oxygen directly into their lungs. Survival rate for the ventilators are like around 50%, but with coronavirus cases, at least in New York, the survival rate is actually around 65%. It's a lot higher. Pretty good stuff, right? That takes time. So it takes a while for people to die. So what's happening right now in Texas is a spike in new coronavirus cases. But what Dan Crenshaw is doing here is talking about how little people have died so far. Well, yeah, because there's a new spread. Just wait a fucking month, Mr. Crenshaw, and then we'll talk about the death rate. Now, there's two different reasons for why that death rate might not be as high. It might be the younger population that's getting coronavirus. As a matter of fact, what we've seen in Texas is the average age is lower for new coronavirus cases. So that could mean that your survival rate is going to be much higher. So that's ultimately a good thing. But it is silly to look at the death rate right now and compare it to Germany, which has, as we have demonstrated here in this graph, successfully prevented the first wave. It's impossible to completely destroy coronavirus new cases unless you're like New Zealand or Vietnam. A couple countries have been able to do it, but it's a very difficult thing to do. But this is what you're looking for. This wave right here is what you're looking for. So Germany went through that already. So they had all of their deaths. But Texas did not.
The spirit of justice.
Texas is now going through their first wave. So do you understand why this is a problem? Because what Texas is doing right now is like looking at Germany, which already went through this. Like Texas is right here, okay? Texas is at March 27 by German standards. Here is Germany, okay? Here's Germany. This is where Germany is. This is where Texas is. Do you understand why this is a silly and dumb comparison, especially when it comes to the death rate, considering the fact that it's going to at least take another couple weeks for us to know what the true death toll looks like as a consequence of coronavirus? It's if Germany was here and they were saying, there's no reason. I think we're doing very well. I mean, look at us versus Italy. Yeah? We're doing that good, yeah. Look at us in comparison to Italy or China, actually, as a matter of fact. I mean, while they were already going through their spike. I hope I was able to clarify this faulty comparison that Dan Crenshaw is making, because he's totally biased. Logic and reasoning in this circumstance, or at least critical thinking in this circumstance, is it goes against a political argument that you might make. And that's precisely why Dan Crenshaw is making this faulty argument.